Hello and welcome everyone to our IT Unity webcast. This is an IT Pro guide for deploying and managing SharePoint 2013 apps. My name is Randy Williams. So again, welcome to our session. Just want to let you know that this is a pre-recorded session, but as we get into the actual Q&A portion of the talk, that will actually be live. So just want to give you a little bit of a heads up on that. And just give you a little bit of a background on who I am. So again, my name is Randy Williams. I'm the Director of AvePoint Client Services, so I'm actually based in San Diego. And my role within AvePoint is to, really the easiest way to describe it is to help our customers maximize their investment in information management systems like SharePoint. I've been working in the SharePoint field for, well, it really started back in the 2001 days, but full-time it's been since 2007 that I've been working with SharePoint full-time. I've had the good fortune of living in some pretty neat places, so I actually called Hawaii home for many years, for about 15 years. Then lived in Singapore, and again, now I call San Diego home. So again, welcome to our session. And just to let you know that I've written a little bit of material out there as well. So I've got a few books. These are some of my older ones, and my most recent one is the SharePoint 2013 Administration Inside Out Guide. In fact, some of the material that I'm taking from this particular talk is coming from one of the chapters of that in that book. Okay, so without further ado, we've got a lot to cover, and just want to give you a little bit of a heads up in terms of our timing. So I know we've got about 1 hour, 60 minutes on the schedule to go through this talk. I've got an awful lot of material, so I'm going to do the best I can to respect your schedule and make sure that I can cover it in an hour, but that probably will mean that our Q&A will run a little bit long, so just want to give you a little bit of a scheduling heads up for that. So in terms of our agenda, we're going to start off by first spending a few minutes just making sure we're all kind of on the same level with respect to 2013 apps. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes introducing the concepts there. We're then going to spend a fair amount of time, probably most of our talk, covering the provisioning aspects. In other words, how do I get it installed? How do I configure it? How do I make sure it's working properly so that we are able to take full advantage of the capabilities? We'll spend a little bit of time talking about some of the management aspects of it. So we'll be talking about how to manage licenses, how to provision the app catalog, and what is it for. So we'll be talking about some of that. And then lastly, and I don't think I'm going to have much time for this, we'll just see how the timing goes. Got a little bit of material on how we would deploy provider-hosted apps. This is just one of the types of applications that a development team might create, and this talks about how to go ahead and configure that within your environment. One other disclaimer before I jump into this, I want to let you know that really what we're talking about for the most part will be using 2013 apps in an on-premises environment. So I'm assuming that you're running SharePoint on premises for this particular talk. You have full support for 2013 apps in Office 365, but it's already provisioned, so it's ready to go day one. There's no additional steps that are necessary. So again, when we get into all the provisioning steps, that will be assuming you're running on premises, but it also could mean that you're running within an infrastructure as a service type of offering, such as Amazon Web Services or perhaps Azure VM. Okay. So with that, let's go ahead and just set some basic groundwork here to make sure we're all on the same page with the basics here. So this is how I describe a SharePoint 2013 app. So this is it from my perspective. An application whose interface is launched from or surfaced through SharePoint, but whose code is executed elsewhere. In other words, it's the concept where we want to be able to deliver powerful applications, provide that application through SharePoint, but it doesn't mean that the code runs on top of SharePoint anymore. And this is, in fact, one of the big differences between the 2013 app model and the full trust code app model that we had previously. With the full trust code app model, the solution model, I should say, the application ran on top of the server object model directly on top of the web front ends. And so that code would run directly with the same worker processes that all the SharePoint code would run. And that's where it would introduce some performance issues, some security issues, some potentially destabilization concerns. And that's a big reason that the full trust code model is starting to die out. So again, back to the 2013 app, we want to deliver a very powerful application experience to our users, but we don't want to risk destabilizing the farm. So we want to surface that application through SharePoint, but actually have that platform of code run somewhere else, somewhere outside the SharePoint farm. So that's the concept. Now, there's a few details on here that for time's sake I'm not going to cover in detail, but for example, that external application, this is the third bullet point, will be calling back into SharePoint using one of the APIs. So because it's not the server object model anymore, we'll be using one of the client object models. So there's the REST API, there's also the client-side object model, or the CSOM as we call it. And then the last bullet point is a key point. There will be no server-side code running directly on the SharePoint servers. So there's no way of invoking the server object model anymore within the 2013 app. Okay? All right, so just giving you a little bit of a context on that. So let's talk just a bit more about how this runs then. So just to give you a perspective, so let's imagine that we've already got a 2013 application deployed into my environment. So that's already been provisioned, as we would say. And that's running within my SharePoint farm. And so I then launch that application. And how that application is going to be surfaced through SharePoint, there's multiple ways. One way is it could be through an iframe. And that would be an example of what we'd call an app part, which is this kind of next generation web part concept. We call it an app part. Another example, and this is what I'm depicting on this particular slide, is it's actually a full screen, a full immersion experience that kind of looks and feels like SharePoint. But in fact, this HTML is generated outside SharePoint, but again, surfaced in a way that it looks like it's coming through SharePoint. And the actual platform on which that HTML is generated could be lots of choices. Could be a normal ASP.NET platform, perhaps running on top of IIS, or it could be any other web platform like Apache that is delivering that and providing it back. So again, this code is executed elsewhere, and from an administration point of view, there's not a lot of detail that you need to know about how that other platform works once you get all the connections and the wiring and the trusts and the trust relationships configured through SharePoint. Okay, so again, on the left-hand side, you've got your SharePoint farm. You've got this concept of a host web and an app web. I'll be talking about that in another slide or two. So again, I click on this application. It then launches in another window in this particular example, but that code that's providing the markup for this window is coming elsewhere. Okay, and then there's some communication back and forth to enable that. So we'll be talking a little bit towards the end on what the OAuth and the S2S, the server-to-server trust, is all about. And as I mentioned before, there's some API callbacks that are done either through the REST API, which is the OData, or the CSOM. Again, we call that the client-side object model. Okay, so let's talk a teeny bit more about this host web and app web. So first off, you should all be okay with web, right? That's just a regular website within SharePoint, within a site collection. So the host web itself, that is where the application, this 2013 app, is either added, removed, or upgraded. So think of it as the parent site, if you will. So it's really where that the 2013 app comes to life, or at least is made available. Now, depending on how this application is written, of course this is determined by the developers, there's going to be or potentially, this is optional, there may be a place where there's additional information that needs to be stored. So maybe there's some lists, maybe there's some libraries, there's another set of pages that you want to make available. In other words, there's other SharePoint artifacts that you want to be able to expose to the user, that you need to use to take advantage of whatever the application needs to do. So if you have these SharePoint artifacts, the developer can choose to create an additional web, we call it an app web, to host all of these components. Now again, this is optional, so if it's a very simple application that doesn't have any need to store any other information, it doesn't need to have an app web. Okay? Although that said, most 2013 apps do in fact have an app web, and when you do have one, this is where it gets very interesting, is you actually have to access that app web using a very unique path. Now technically that app web is a sub-web to where the host web is. So again, remember the host web is the parent. Think of the app web as being the child, so the parent spawns the child. But even though the app web is a sub-web of the parent, you cannot access it using the normal path that you would be able to access from the host web. So I've got this example that you can see on the bottom. So let's imagine for a moment that my host web, its URL is pointed to teams.contoso.com. So that's the actual URL to where the host web is located. But the app web that I have, which is called my app, is got this really long kind of goofy URL. It looks like it's got a hex string, it's got a completely different domain. It doesn't look like it has any reference at all to the host web. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in another slide or two, but the basic purpose of that is to provide a separate isolated area where this application can run so that there isn't any security risk, so that that code could potentially read cookies that could live within the host web. So again, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but predominantly the reason for that isolation, that separation, if you will, is again for a security reason. It helps reduce the risk of cross-site scripting. All right, so it's a teeny bit on the host web and app web. So let's try to decompose this for just a moment. So that app web URL actually consists of 5 different parts. And so I'm just going to walk through this just really quickly to make sure you understand how it comes together. So the first part here, number 1, is the app prefix. So we're going to talk about how you configure the app prefix in our second section. That's on the provisioning support for 2013 apps. So it's just an app prefix, and this will be global across your SharePoint farm. You set that up one time. The second is an application ID. So this is something SharePoint will do for you automatically. It's one of the service applications, as we'll see. And it's basically sort of like a GUID. So it's a unique hex string that's going to uniquely identify this instance of the application. So again, I said this instance. So if I have 5 instances of one application running from 5 different host webs, I would have 5 different unique hex strings. Okay, so it's not unique to the application itself, it's unique to the application instance. Okay, so each time I provision an instance of that app, I'll get a new app ID. Okay, so again, that's controlled by SharePoint. You don't have any influence over that. The third part is the app domain. So this is the domain in which you want the DNS domain. Let's be clear, it's not a Windows domain, it's the DNS domain that you want this app to run. And this is getting back to, again, that concept that I talked about with avoiding cross-site scripting for a security reason. So let's just say for a moment, I want to give you a teeny bit more context on this. Let's say that you have within your organization, and we'll say that your organization is contoso.com, just to kind of match what I've got on the screen here. So if your organization is contoso.com, you have, let's say, a number of different applications, legacy applications perhaps, that are running all within the contoso.com domain. For example, you've got a custom, let's say an old school ASP, not even ASP.NET, an old ASP application that's running at hr.contoso.com. So it's providing some features to your employees that HR uses. And so that application was written many, many years ago. And so again, that's at hr.contoso.com. And so this app domain here, you have the choice to still run that in the same top-level domain. So I can run this under, let's say, apps.contoso.com. So notice it's in the same domain within my HR application, right? My HR application is hr.contoso.com, and my 2013 apps, we'll say for a moment, will be apps.contoso.com. So because it's running in the same domain space, depending on how the security of the cookies are from your old legacy HR application, they may be able to be read. In other words, do you want to have a SharePoint 2013 app that could potentially read, maybe even write the cookies to your old legacy HR application? That could be a big security risk. And it really depends on how old that application is and how well those cookies were secured from that legacy application. So because that's a risk, your apps.contoso.com example here is a completely separate domain. Right, so it's not within the same domain namespace, so therefore it's in a completely separate area, and therefore you're not going to have the risk where a 2013 app could read cookies from a different application because it's in a different top-level domain. Okay, so again, that's the primary reason why you'd want to isolate this into a different domain area. Again, it's optional, but it's a best practice from a security point of view. All right, so that was the third one. The fourth one is the host web relative URL. So this really consists of two parts. It consists of your managed path. So in this particular example in purple, I have /sites/projects, right? So that's the managed path to where the site collection is, or the root web of the site collection. And then the second part of that is, in this case, /foo, it's just the path from that site collection to wherever this host web happens to be located, right? So it could be several levels down from that root web in the site collection, so you just need to reference each and every path. Okay, so we call that the host web relative URL. And then last but not least is the app name. So this is the fifth part of it, and this is just the actual name that the developer provides to this application when it was created. Okay, so that's just, in this case, in this example, my app. All right, so that's how we decompose the web application URL. So from that, let's go ahead and check out and see how this is actually working. So I'm going to go ahead and break from my slides for a moment. Let me come over into my SharePoint 2013 instance here. Let's flip over into my top level website here. All right, so this is just a normal SharePoint website, actually just running a very simple web application, a very simple site collection with the team site as my site template. And so within this, I'm going to come down into my site contents. And I already have a 2013 app that I provisioned earlier. Now, I'll provision another one in just a moment, but just to show you this real quickly. And in fact, before I click on it, let's just do this. Let me go ahead and create a notepad file here, just to compare these different URLs. So here's the URL of my host web. Okay, so again, this is the web, the parent web, if you will, where the application was provisioned. It's also where it's launched from. Okay, so I've got that in place. Now let's go ahead and launch the application. In this particular case, it gives me a full screen window, and it just provides whatever capabilities that that application provides. But the URL is very different. So again, let me copy this into our notepad file. Let's try to compare these two. Oop, I didn't get the right one. Let's try that again. Copy, and then paste. So it's pretty long. But really, it's just this part of it that we care about. So let me just remove that second half of it. All right, so again, here is our host web on the top. Okay, and then here is our app web. So in this particular case, this application clearly does have an app web. It's where the developer is choosing to store some SharePoint artifacts specific to this application. Okay. And again, technically, this application, this is the app name, My Locations, is technically a subweb underneath this host web, but it's not accessible that way. In fact, it only allows you to access it using the fully qualified name, and again, this completely other domain that we've been talking about. Okay, so that's the host web, that's the app web, and you can see that in action. Okay. So let's come back to our slides. I'm going to actually provision an application in just a minute, but let's talk about a couple of at least one other point here. So based on that initial information, let's talk a little bit more about security from another perspective. And so this is a brand new concept. It might seem a little bit weird, so bear with me as I go through the concepts here. In SharePoint 2013, in this new world of apps, Microsoft has introduced this concept called an Appt Principle. An Appt Principle. The idea behind an Appt Principle is we actually now have a first-class citizen, this entity that doesn't represent a person. It's not a user principle, but in fact represents an application. And this is actually a pretty powerful concept, and let me try to explain for a moment why this is so useful. If we think back to the old days, right, way back in the past, again with our full trust farm solutions, our full trust code. When we talked about security within that model, the default behavior with code that would run is it would impersonate the user under whose identity that code was running. So for example, if we had a user by the name of Sally, and Sally was just a visitor within a particular, let's say, website in SharePoint, meaning she just had read access. If there's a web part that was placed on a web page, that web part would be running under Sally's security context, meaning that would also only just have read access. Now that's the default behavior, and those developers that are listening in here probably are familiar with a way of elevating permissions, right? We had this concept of run with elevated privileges, which would allow you to run that code within the context of the system account. It's one of the things that you could do. Well, but here's the problem with that. So code is pretty much either running in the context of the user, which could be too much permissions, or it could be too little permissions, or it could be elevated to this sort of system level account, which is probably in most cases too much access. In other words, it's really hard to narrow in and provide the right level of access for the application. And again, that's because it was really all based on this concept of user principles in the past. So again, let's fast forward to the present now. We have this concept of Appt Principle. So we actually have a first-class security context that allows me, when I say first class, that means it has all the same capabilities as what a user would have, so that I can actually grant permissions to the application independent of the user who then invokes it. Okay? All right, so again, so we have this concept of an Appt Principle. It'll be the developer that determines what permissions this application will have at provisioning. Okay, so it's the application developer who makes that choice. And here's where it gets interesting. These permissions are actually delegated at the time that the application is provisioned. So again, if I choose to create a new instance of an application, I'm going to provision it at that moment in time. And once I trust this application, if you guys have ever seen this, and I'll demonstrate this in just a moment, this is the actual point where those permissions are granted. Okay, so whatever permissions the developer has asked for, when you trust it, you're actually granting the application those permissions. So that's really what trust means in this concept. Do you trust the developer who wrote this application to use those permissions in a proper way? And those permissions will be listed here on the actual screen that you're seeing. Okay, so what access it's going to be asking for is the access that you're going to be granting. Okay, so I've got a little bit more on that I want to talk about, but before I go further, let me just break from my slides. In case you haven't seen this before, let me show you where that actually comes up. So if we come back to our SharePoint site, and let's go ahead and provision a new application. We'll just do it very quickly here. So let's come to Site Contents, let's add an app. And if you haven't noticed, apps are actually coming in different flavors now. This concept of what we used to call a site template, or excuse me, a list template and a library template is also considered an app, but we're not talking about that type of app. We're talking about bona fide, custom developed applications. So let's just come out to the SharePoint store very quickly. This is just the marketplace. And I'm just going to grab one very quickly just to give you an idea how this works. So we're going to add this application to my SharePoint site. We're pulling it down from the SharePoint store. Okay, we can ignore that. So I'm going to go ahead and continue. So at this point, I'm actually just getting the license. Okay, so I've now added the license. Let's return to the site. And notice that I do want to add this app to my Teams. So in other words, I want to add this to my host web called Teams. So let's go ahead and start that process. And here's finally that dialog where it asks me to trust this. So again, at this point in time, we're just about ready to provision an instance of this new application. It's asking me for permissions here. Okay, these are all the different lists that it's asking for read permissions on. So these are, by the way, these are in the host web. Right? So these are permissions that would be granted to the host web. If this application uses an Appt Web, and in fact it does, it will automatically have access to the Appt Web because the Appt Web is specific to that app instance. These would be permissions to the host web. Okay, so just want to make sure you're clear about that. All right, so when I click on Trust, it's going to then be granting that Appt Principle, this new Appt Principle instance that it's creating, and giving it those permissions that I just asked for. Okay, so that's, again, that's what trust really means in this context. All right, so back to our slide. Okay, so here's a key point here. If the user does not have permissions that the app needs, it cannot be provisioned. What does that mean? Well, what it means is let's say that I was a user that was provisioning a new instance of this application, and this application is asking for a very high level of access. Maybe it's asking for full permissions to, let's say, the whole tenancy, which we'll talk about in a moment. And I, as a regular user, I don't have permissions to grant that access. Well, if I don't have permissions myself to do something, I cannot grant that access to the application, or in this case, the Appt Principle. Okay, so it's a key point. So at no point can a user grant this new Appt Principle permissions greater than what he or she currently has. Okay, it will fail. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this. So again, the developer has control over lots of different things on how the permissions and security works. Here's another characteristic that's interesting to note. So remember a few minutes ago I talked about this concept of an Appt Principle being different than the user principle, which is what we had in the old days of the full trust code within our farm solution model. Well, here's a very similar concept to that. By default, assuming an application has already been provisioned, which means the Appt Principle has already been created, and all the permissions that the Appt Principle needs has been granted. So let's assume that's already in place, right? So the app instance is good to go. And that was, let's say, done by user Sally. Now Paul comes into this website as a user, and he actually tries to then launch this application. So maybe he clicks on that particular icon from, let's say, some link that's been made available. So when Paul launches this, what if Paul does not have access to, let's say, a list in the host web that the application needs? Well, curiously enough, by default, you've got this what we call allow app only policy. Is you have two ways that permissions can be validated. The default that we're showing here on the top is both the user and the application itself must have permissions to perform an action. So let's assume that code within this application needs to read from a tasks list in the host web. Okay, this application needs to read items from a tasks list in the host web. The application has permissions to do that. It was granted when it was trusted. But Paul as a user does not have access to that list. Well, in that particular case, it will fail because the app has access, but the user does not. But the policy requires that both user and app have access. So that's done, if you might guess, for security reasons. But the developer can override that behavior. She can actually go in to the app manifest that's defined within that application and say, I only want the app only policy, which basically means that the user doesn't need to have access, just the application does. And so that's pretty powerful, right? So that's where this concept of elevation could actually come in. Again, the user would not need to have access to it, just the application itself. All right? So another security setting that the developer has control over. Now, that being said, let's talk just a little bit about the kinds of permissions that you have. So first bullet point I want to make note of is that permissions for an application, an Appt Principle, are not the same as the permissions that you're used to with user principles. In other words, they're not the same type of access where it's inherited down a hierarchy. For example, if I have access to a web in SharePoint, some subweb, assuming that I have not broken inheritance, let's say I have contribute access, that contribute access would apply to libraries and folders and items in that library, right? That's how the inheritance model works with user principles. Well, with Appt Principles, it's a little bit different. It's not quite the same. And so I'm not going to cover this in detail, but I just want to point out that at a basic level, there are 4 scopes that the developer can set permissions for the application. And so those 4 levels are on the screen: tenancy, site collection, web, and list. And so that basically defines the scope. And then in addition to this scope, you define the level of access. Is it full control? Is it read-only? And so with this concept, you can get pretty close to being somewhat granular. It's not super, super granular where I can say, I just want this list and I just want that web and that's it. It's not really quite that flexible. But it's pretty good, and it's better than what we had before in the full trust code model. So again, I would pick the scope, I would pick the level of access, and that's then, again, what would be granted to the application, to the Appt Principle upon provisioning. Okay? All right, so we've talked about the app receives requested permissions to all objects contained in this scope at provisioning, right? That's what trust, as we've already seen, really means. Okay, all right, so we've already seen this demo. We've reviewed the Appt Web URL. So let's go ahead and move to our second section now. Let's talk a little bit about how we provision support for 2013 apps. So again, I'm making the assumption, friends, that we're talking about an on-premises environment. You don't have to go through any of this if you're in Office 365. Okay? All right, so if you want to host apps, these 2013 apps, in an on-premises world, or again, in an infrastructure as a service world like AWS or Azure, there are 4 things you have to do. Step number 1, you have to create an app tenancy. We'll see what that's like, but there are 2 service applications that need to be created in your farm. You have to create, number 2, the app URL settings. Okay, we'll see how to do that. It's very simple. You can do that either in PowerShell or in central administration. Number 3, you're going to be configuring a redirection web application. I'll explain what that means and why you need to do that. And number 4, you need to do a little bit of work with DNS. Okay, so there's some work within your domain name service, your domain name system, to make sure that name resolution is working properly. Okay, so these are the 4 steps. We're going to walk through each step one by one. Okay, so creating an app tenancy, what do we have to do? All right, it's pretty simple. We just need to create 2 service applications. One is the app management service. One is the subscriptions settings service. So we're going to go ahead and create both of those. We can create those pretty easily with PowerShell. In fact, I have the whole script on the screen in just a minute or 2 that you can get. Since we're creating new service applications, we'll have application pools. So for the application pools here, there's a little bit of misinformation out on the interweb on this, but you do not want to use the farm account for these application pools. It's best to have a separate account, and then by definition, a separate application pool that would be used. Now you can share the same application pool across both of these if you'd like, and if you have a shared application pool you're using for other service applications, and there's not a big security reason for you to isolate them, you could also share that one as well across these 2 service applications. But I would not advise you, at least in a production capacity, I do not advise you to use the farm account. Hey, that account also does not need to be a local administrator. Okay, it's very rare within a SharePoint context that an account would need to be a local admin. This account definitely does not. Okay, and then you'll want to make sure you start this server on your designated servers. If you're talking about a load-balanced farm, a production farm with lots of servers, let's say medium or large farm, I'm going to assume you're going to be running that on at least 2 servers. Right? You want 2 servers primarily for the fault tolerance. Right? If one server goes down, you want to make sure there are other servers that can still process requests for these 2 service apps. Okay, so that one's pretty straightforward. And I'll keep this script on the screen for a moment or 2. But this is how you can go ahead and create it all from scratch, right from PowerShell. Okay, so this one's pretty straightforward, and there are 2 new databases that you'll create. Okay, so that's one of the reasons that I recommend doing it from PowerShell, is to make sure that you have control over what that database name is, to make sure that you don't get any of those ugly GUIDs. I'm sure you've all seen those probably before. Okay, so that'll get the app tenancy in place. That is the first of 4 steps. Okay, so let's talk about the second step. This one's even easier. There are 2 URL settings that we have to define. So there's the app domain and the app prefix. Now, if you recall, a few minutes ago, we talked about the 5 different components to an Appt Web URL. This is 2 of them. So again, what do you want the app domain to be? Do you want it to be a unique top-level domain like appscontoso.com, or do you want to share an existing domain that you already have? And just be mindful of the cross-site scripting risk that we talked about earlier. Okay, so you set your app domain, you set what your prefix is going to be, and as you can see on the screen there, you can set it in either central admin or PowerShell. Okay, so very, very simple. Just make sure you do that. And this is a farm level setting. So you set this for the whole farm. All right, so that's number 2. All right, so number 3 is where it starts to get a little bit tricky. And there's lots of ways to do this, by the way, guys. So these 4 steps that I have here, this is the model that I use because it works in all scenarios. At least it's worked in every scenario that I've come across, and I've done this for a lot of different customers. So I find it to be very consistent and works very well. But I do acknowledge there's more than one way to skin this cat. So the way I do it is, number 3 is I create a dedicated web application for what I call redirection. So I'm kind of using air quotes, even though you can't see that. This is my redirection web app. So the idea here, let me try to give you a little bit of background on why I'm doing this, is we need to make sure that this app web is going to be able to be processed by the SharePoint pipeline. And let me just flip back to my URLs for just a moment. All right, so this particular URL, that really doesn't look like a SharePoint URL, at least the first portion of it. How does SharePoint get to be able to process that particular entity? That's really what we're talking about. So I need to make sure that URL can be run through the SharePoint pipeline. Okay? Now there's a lot of details on this, and I cover this in a lot more detail in my book. But let me just try to give you a summary on how this redirect web app is going to be configured. So first off, you're going to be creating first off a normal SharePoint web app. Nothing special about that. You can create it in Central Admin if you prefer. PowerShell also works. But you're going to want to make sure the host header is set to blank. It's a very important step. Do not give this web application a host header. Okay, and the reason is because the host header portion is usually this part of the URL. Well, if you recall, this part here is in fact going to change based on the instance of the application. Right? So if I have another instance of this application or a completely different application, its own instance, that URL changes. So this effectively, friends, becomes a wildcard. That's effectively what we need. We need to be able to have some type of wildcard character there. And IIS does not support wildcard host names. And so to get around that, the best thing to do is just to leave it blank. In fact, the only thing you can do is to make sure you leave it blank. Okay, it does not work if you do not, well, I should say it does not work if you have a host header entered. Okay, keep it blank. Okay, you do not need a content database for this. This is another example where there's a lot of misinformation out there. This is not a normal SharePoint web application. It will not be hosting content. You will not have any site collections mounted against it. Therefore, you do not need a content database. Okay, it's only used for app redirection. Okay, the next step. So you got the web application. I think it works best if you bind this new SharePoint web application, or at least in the IIS context, its website, bind that to a dedicated IP address. What does that mean? Well, it means that you're going to be adding another, at least one more IP address to that web server. Okay, now that's not an uncommon thing. It's actually pretty typical to multi-home servers with multiple addresses. Server admins do it all the time. So if you dedicate, or you have this dedicated redirection web application, its IP address is going to be unique and separate from any other address that's used on the server. The reason we're doing that is to avoid any type of IIS binding conflict. You guys ever seen any of those, right? If you've got characteristics whereby you don't have a unique IP address, port name, or host header, you can actually have a binding conflict in IIS, and they're really frustrating. They're hard to fix. So this is really the only reason that I'm recommending a dedicated IP address. By having a unique IP address, I can guarantee that you will not have a binding conflict. Okay? All right, and then the third step, and this is also where it starts to get a little bit tricky, is this idea of SSL. Right, so if I come back to my URLs, you can see that I'm actually using SSL. Okay, in both cases, both on the web application, the host web, and the app web. And SSL is in fact strongly recommended. The primary reason is because I'm going to be exchanging sensitive token information, OAuth details, between the actual application itself, where the developer wrote it, we would call that the remote web, and SharePoint. And if I don't have SSL that's encrypting that network channel, it's actually pretty easy to use some type of network capturing tool, like Wireshark or Netmon or something of that sort, actually see that transaction, replay it back, and then actually be able to hijack the session and do some type of man-in-the-middle attack. Okay, so to protect the integrity of that transaction, of that connection between the client, SharePoint, and this external application, you want to make sure SSL is in place. So in this case, you're using SSL on your web application that we're using for redirection. And if you're using SSL here, you absolutely want to use SSL here as well. Okay, so in fact, is a general rule, they both either need to use SSL or neither of them use SSL. Okay, so for most of my customers nowadays, if they're going to be using the 2013 app model, I'm already telling them, make sure you have SSL in place for all your other web applications. Okay? Okay, so hopefully you now at least agree why we need to have SSL. The part where it gets a little bit trickier is we actually have to have a wildcard certificate. So I'm not going to cover every little detail on this, but usually when you create an SSL certificate, whether you're going to use certificate servers or you're going to use MakeCert or you're going to go to some third-party company like VeriSign and buy one, you have to tell it if it's going to be a wildcard cert or a specific one. So here's an example of a wildcard cert. So I'm actually using a wildcard hostname portion of the fully qualified domain name so that I can use this multiple times. So for example, it would work with this example. If I type it in right, it would also work with this example. Hopefully I typed those in properly. Looks like I missed something here. Oh, I'm missing my SSL. There we go. Okay, so again, a wildcard SSL certificate could be reused multiple times because the actual hostname portion of the fully qualified domain name varies. Normal certificates that you buy can only be used single instance, so the subject name will actually match that exact URL. Okay, so make sure that you're using wildcard SSL certificates is what I'm getting at. Okay? All right, and then you're going to bind this certificate, this SSL certificate, to this specific redirect web application. Okay? So let me show you a little bit of that before we go any further. All right, so let me come here into Central Administration. Let me show you that part first. And I need to pick up the pace here. So here are my list of web applications that I'm using in my SharePoint farm here within my lab. So I've got my normal teams.contoso.com. We work with that already. Here's the one for my sites. Here's my app redirection. Okay, so you'll notice the URL that I'm using from a SharePoint context. I'm not going to show you, but you'll just have to trust me. I have no content databases or site collections that are associated with that one. Here's what it looks like in IIS. So here are my list of sites. Let's make sure I've got the current version. Yep, very good. So here again, here's my teams. Here's my sites. Here's my redirection. And if I go to my redirection, let's take a look at our bindings. In my case here, you'll notice that I'm binding to a specific IP address. So I talked about that earlier, right? I want to make sure that I'm not going to have any binding conflict. And you'll notice that the host name is blank. Okay, so we talked about that already. So that's pretty important. Okay, and then if I look at my SSL certificate here, you can see that I'm actually binding that to my wildcard SSL cert. Okay, so I actually created my certificates in my lab here from Certificate Server, which is one of the add-ins for Active Directory. But you can get them in lots of other places. Again, you can use MakeCert, you can buy them from VeriSign or Thought or whoever your favorite certificate authority is. Okay, so that's a little bit on what I've shown you so far. Let's come back to my slides, and I've got one last step here we need to look at. So if you've gotten this far, you're doing really well. Actually, yeah, so let me just show you this slide here just to kind of point out what I just, very close to what I just showed you in my demo. Here's an example of how bindings could look for a server. So in this particular example, I'm using unique IP addresses for every single web application. That's not really a requirement. Really, all you really need to have is a dedicated IP address for your redirect web app, the one shown here on the bottom. But for consistency's sake, I've chosen to keep each one also unique. So Teams has got 10, my portal has got 11. Okay, so that's just a sample, and that's pretty close to what I'm doing in my environment. Okay, so what is the fourth step? So the fourth one is pretty easy compared to the previous step. we just need to make sure that we get name resolution to work properly. So the idea here is I need to make sure that when anything gets requested for this new domain, this appscontoso.com, for example, I need to make sure that it can resolve properly to the IP address that's going to be bound to my web server. So if I break from my slides for a minute, let me just try to walk you through this very quickly. As a reminder, if I come back to my redirect web application, I look at my bindings. Again, you'll notice that I'm binding this to the address 10.0.0.162. Okay? If I come out to a command prompt window for a moment, just to point out here are all of my bindings, so you'll notice that 162 is one of the addresses that I've bound to this particular server. Okay? And from a DNS point of view, actually let's just do anything because it doesn't really matter. Let me ping that particular name to see if it resolves properly. It looks like it does, so this is just some wildcard. It's just any host name. I just put in some random characters, .appcontoso.com. That comes back to 162, which resolves properly back to the binding for my redirect web app. So that's, again, how I can force it to go through that SharePoint pipeline to make sure that SharePoint knows how to process this individual app request. Okay, so how did I get DNS to do this? Well, let me break from this VM and flip over to another one for just a moment. So here's my DNS server, and I've actually created a completely separate zone in DNS to do this. Here's my appscontoso.com zone, and here is my wildcard entry that I've created. So it's just an A record, and it points to that particular IP address. And because it's a wildcard entry, I can again use it for any particular name that comes up. So if we flip back over here again, and I just do another example, appscontoso.com. If I can type right, there we go. Okay, now so I'm sure a couple of you are wondering, well, gosh, that's great. How does this work through load balancers? Well, it really doesn't change much with load balancers, friends. You would just make sure that you're also adding multiple addresses, IP addresses, that is, to your load balancer, and making sure that then those then redirect properly to each of the web server instances that your load balancer is managing, right? All the different servers in your cluster. So this is fully supported through load balancers, and I've used it for both Windows network load balancing and most of the load balancers you'll find out there in the marketplace, including F5. Okay? All right, so let's take a deep breath on that. I know there's a lot of different steps there, but let me just really quickly recap those 4 steps that are necessary to provision your apps. Right? So you created an app tenancy. Remember, there's 2 service applications you have to provision. Second, you have to configure your app URL settings. That's your prefix and your domain name. We talked about some security implications on how to choose the right domain name. We talked about configuring a redirection web application in SharePoint. I advise you to dedicate that to its own IP address. Keep the host header on that blank. You don't need to have any content databases mounted to that. There's a little bit with SSL that you want to make sure you set up properly, and you bind that. You bind your wildcard SSL certificate to your redirection web application. And last, as we just saw, you configure DNS with a new zone, and then you point that to the IP address that's associated with your redirect web app. Okay, whew, so that's a mouthful. So hopefully you guys are okay with that. So that is how you get all the provisioning in place. And again, I've used this for lots of customers. It works in all scenarios. Feel free to use it for yours as well. Okay, so we've got about 10, maybe 12 minutes or so to talk about some 2013 app things. So a little bit on the management side. So one of the things, probably one of the most important things you need to know about to managing these properly is whether or not you need to create an app catalog. Okay, so an app catalog is a concept that's used in 2013 apps, and it really has 2 purposes, as you can see on the screen. One is it helps you manage internally developed apps. What does that mean? Well, if you're going to be let's say you have a dev team within your company, or you're contracting this out to an outside service, a system integrator. Let's say that a 2013 app has been written for you. This application is not going to be put in the marketplace. It's not going to be available. It's not going to be sold online. You just want a custom app to be able to be used and deployed by your own users within your organization. right? So that's one example of why you'd want to have an app catalog. It's a place where you can actually deploy your 2013 apps. So I'm not going to cover the details on how this works, but basically the output that the developer team would create, one of the outputs I should say, would be a .app file. That's where the manifest for the application is stored, and that's where a lot of the permissions that we've talked about that the Appt Principle will need will be stored, what the app policy is. Basically this .app file, that is added into the app catalog. And by publishing it into the app catalog, that's how other users across the organization can then deploy your app instances, can deploy instances of this app. Okay? All right, so that's one purpose for the app catalog. The second purpose is it allows you to manage app requests. What does that mean? Well, app requests means that I may not want to let users, by default, just go out to the SharePoint store, right, this public marketplace, and be able to find any application they want. I need a little bit of governance around that. I want to control who can do that or who has access to do that. And so what you can do as an alternate is instead of letting users just go directly out there, finding and provisioning their own applications, you can have users request access to 2013 apps. So they can request an application to an app in the marketplace, but there's someone else that's then going to actually approve and provision it for them. Okay? So that's one bit of governance that you can have to control whether or not you want them to go directly out to the marketplace or not. Okay? So those are the two purposes of an app catalog. All right, the second bullet point, pretty straightforward. The web app, each web application, I should say, will only have one app catalog. And an app catalog is only associated with one web application. So in other words, there's a one-to-one relationship between a web application and an app catalog. So if I have 3 web applications that I'm using in my environment, and I want to be able to consume apps from all 3 of those web applications, I will need to have 3 app catalogs. Does that make sense? Okay. And the script that you can see on the screen here, an app catalog is just a normal site collection. So feel free to provision that under any normal way that you create site collections in your environment. Okay, so this talks a little bit about how to manage the app requests. So again, the idea here is I do not want to allow users to go out to the SharePoint store and install their own apps. I'm going to make sure that they request them. So this is a little bit easier for me just to demo rather than talk through it. So let me break from the slides for a second. Let's come back out into SharePoint. And what I want to do here is I want to come down into my app settings within my SharePoint farm. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to configure the store settings. And for this particular web application, you'll notice a very important question here. Should users be able to get apps from the SharePoint store? So if you say yes, then any user that has the create web permission, or basically anyone that's a site owner, at least by default, would have permissions to be able to go out to create a web, or excuse me, would be able to go out to the SharePoint store and create an app instance. Okay, now, this doesn't mean all users can. Again, you need to have the create web permission. I don't think I mentioned that earlier, although I did have that on the slide. If you say no, users cannot go out to the store. They can browse the store, and they can request it. So the analogy that I like to use, it's sort of like if you choose yes, you are giving your son a credit card and you're allowing him to go out and buy whatever he wants. If you say no, you're letting him go out and browse the store and he'll come back with a list of things that he wants to buy, but you still have the credit card and you control what you're actually going to allow. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's how that works. And again, this is controlled on a web app by web app basis. Okay, so if you've turned off the ability to get apps directly from the marketplace, then what you're going to have to do, if you go out to the app catalog for a web application, so here's my app catalog for my teams.contoso.com. I'll just click on that really quickly. Here's where my app request will then be stored. It's just a very simple SharePoint list. Okay? All right, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea about how that works. Got about 5 or so minutes to go. Okay, and if you want to delegate the management of these app requests, that's all done by just granting a site collection admin to to that particular app catalog. Okay, so you may not want a farm admin to be the person that's managing these app requests. So feel free to delegate this off to the business, but this is done on an app catalog basis, which means it's done across the whole web application. Okay. All right, and then it talks a little bit more then about the licensing. By default, farm administrators are also the license administrators. And again, this is probably another example of something that probably would be given off to the business. Well, the way this works is each and every license is going to be, each and every license can be delegated to one or more license administrators. And these could be other people within the business. So let's say that you're running, let's say, the Meetings app, which is one of the apps that my company, AppPoint, has in the marketplace. You might go ahead and have two different license administrators in the business who are the admins for that particular license. Okay. Now, license is another subject that has a little bit more detail. For time's sake, we're not going to cover it in this talk, but it's pretty straightforward, not too tricky to do. Okay, so let's just cover a couple of common questions, and I think I've already asked this first one. Who can provision apps? So again, by default, site owners can, plus anyone who has the create subsites and manage website permissions. Okay, so again, not every user can provision an instance of an app. Okay, now of course users can run an application that's already been provisioned, assuming they have the right permissions, and we talked about that earlier. Okay, and we've also talked about the second sub-bullet, provisioning user must have permissions requested by the app. Okay, can I completely disable the SharePoint store? I get this a lot. I don't want people to even go out there and browse the marketplace. I don't even want them to see it. Well, unfortunately, at least out of the box, you can't turn it off entirely. Right, so we've talked about the ability that they can only request rather than install directly, but your only workaround in this case is to edit your added app.aspx page. That's one of your application pages within the SharePoint root. You literally have to edit that page and remove the link. Right, so this would be the link to the SharePoint store. Let me just show you where that would be. If I come out here to, let's say, add an app, click on that there. So here's the add an app page, right? So what I would be doing is I would be removing this link here. Okay, so it's kind of a hack, and technically a user could type in this URL directly if he or she knew how to do that. So again, it's not a guaranteed fix, but hopefully for the most users it would work. And then of course any time you're changing an out-of-the-box application page, be a little bit careful. Make sure you document that. And if you ever do install a cumulative update or a service pack, make sure that you confirm that that behavior is still in place, because that does oftentimes get changed in new updates. Right? That's basically an out-of-the-box SharePoint file. Okay, so hopefully you have a little bit of a better idea on how that works. Now, I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'm just going to talk through these slides just very, very briefly, because I want to make sure we have some time for Q&A. So let me just kind of set the stage here first, though, before I even go any further. So within the 2013 app world, there's basically today two different types of applications the developers can write. There are what are called SharePoint hosted apps, and there are provided hosted apps. A SharePoint hosted app is really a pretty simple application that will have a app web, right? So we talked about the app web earlier, but there's no server-side code. There's no external remote web. There's no code, of course, running on top of your SharePoint farm. It's really just code, let's say JavaScript code running perhaps from the browser, calling back into, let's say, the client-side object model. Okay, but there's no server-side code effectively, not really any compiled code, if that makes sense. Right? That's your SharePoint hosted app. Your provider-hosted app is far more powerful, but also far more complex. It can have, optionally, a app web, as we've talked about, but it can also have, and it will have, in fact, another server-side portion that we call the remote web. And this is the one that's running on some other platform. So at the top of our talk, I talked about, let's say, an ASP.NET web application, or maybe it's a PHP application running on top of Apache in some Linux platform that you have. So it's some other platform that is calling back through SharePoint using one of the remote APIs to surface its application through SharePoint. Okay, so again, that's what a custom provider-hosted app would do. Okay, so just a couple of the details here. So the server-side code runs remotely, right? It does not run on the SharePoint farm. So again, it doesn't run on top of the SharePoint farm. It runs, let's say, side by side or away from the farm. As we've already talked about, each app has an Appt Principle. Each app instance, I should say, right? We've already seen how that is done, and we've talked about when you click on that trust, that's in fact what it's really doing. It's creating that Appt Principle and granting it the permissions. Now, this is where it starts to get a little bit more complex because there's actually relationships with SharePoint and potentially, if you're doing this through Office 365, with Azure Active Directory, or what I should say Azure ACS, the Azure Control Services, to be able to configure either an OAuth trust or what's called a server-to-server trust, S2S, sometimes called a high trust. Now, for time's sake, again, we don't really have an opportunity to go through this in detail. This is mostly developer stuff that a developer would be managing. I talk about it also within my book in much more detail, but I just have a little bit of slides I'm not going to really speak to in detail that would talk about the script that would be needed depending on what your scenario happens to be. So this particular scenario would be if I want to configure OAuth in SharePoint, the assumption or the scenario would be that I'm basically running a provider-hosted app on premises, and then I'm consuming that through an Office Online, or excuse me, a SharePoint Online instance inside Office 365. So there's a little bit of work that you have to do with that. Okay. Another scenario is I've got an on-premises SharePoint farm and a provider-hosted app that's going to run in some other environment outside SharePoint. And I'm going to be configuring that not using OAuth, a derivative of OAuth that we call S2S. It's called S2S is server-to-server trust. It's also called high trust in a lot of the blogs that you'll read. This describes some of the ways that you basically configure the security by sharing certificates between these two environments. And the concept here is that I'm basically creating a trust between my SharePoint farm and the environment where this provided hosted app is running. So I know that those two systems can be able to communicate securely and deliver trusted, secure messages. And that's another reason why we'd also want to make sure SSL is in place so that that communication platform cannot be intercepted. Okay, and then a little bit of code on what's actually needed to configure that. Again, this example would be for an S2S trust, for an on-premises remote app, and an on-premises SharePoint farm. Okay, so a little bit of work to get all those in place. I apologize that we don't have a lot of time to cover that in detail. Again, I do cover this in my book in a little bit more detail. But just real quickly as we're wrapping up here, we talked about some of the basic concepts of 2013 apps. What are they for? How are they different from the full trust code model we had in the past? We talked about the 4 steps to provision support for 2013 apps. So don't forget those. We talked about the app catalog and licensing and some of the steps that you have to be able to manage your SharePoint 2013 apps properly. And then just real briefly, we spent a couple minutes talking about your provided hosted app scenarios. So with that, I just want to point out again, this does come from my most recent book. So this is one of the longer chapters in the book. So chapter 15, feel free to read through that and get a lot more detail. You can find this at any place you like to buy your favorite books. I've got a little bit of additional rating if you want to get a little bit more detail on some of these items. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and break from my recorded session. I'm going to be live for Q&A coming up in just a minute. But before I do that, let me again thank you for your time. I hope you all found this session helpful, and I certainly wish you all the best of luck. Take care. Let's open up the floor for questions.